Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, Peniel Joseph.
Okay, thank you. I have 15 minutes to talk about social justice and the search for the beloved community. And I'm going to keep my 15 minutes. I'm very excited to be here. I'm honored to be here. I always give praise and thanks to not just God, but to my mother, Jermaine Joseph, who's about to turn 80 years old, who was my first social justice teacher. I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants. I was on my first picket line in New York City in elementary school. I'm 46 years old now, and I owe everything to my mother, Jermaine Joseph. I'm the proud father of 3 children, and I'm trying to give them that same example. Very quickly, because some of my friends and critics say that when I'm up here on stage, I go from 0 to 60 in just a few seconds. And what I want to talk about today is really the beloved community and racial optimism. I want to talk about racial optimism, but I also want to talk about racial realism and how we can get to that beloved community free of racism, violence, segregation, poverty, injustice that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed about. We had contemporary social activists just on stage, and in a lot of ways, activists who are talking about voting rights for Latinx groups, who are talking about Black Lives Matter, are really standing on the shoulders of the Black freedom struggle. Earlier, Dr. Moore talked about corporate language, and we talk about multiculturalism, we talk about diversity, but what we're really talking about, and what Dr. King talked about, was this struggle for Black citizenship. And what Dr. King meant by Black citizenship was this idea that Black people in America were not only no longer going to be dehumanized, marginalized, incarcerated, murdered, lynched, but that they were going to have real guaranteed rights and freedoms. But when we think about this idea of intersectionality, Dr. King understood that what he was talking about in terms of citizenship rights and the beloved community was something that was universal. But he searched for that universality through the particular lens of the Black freedom struggle in the United States. And when we think about this year, this is an exceptional year when we think about the beloved community, because this would have been Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 90th birthday. This is also the 400th anniversary of 1619 and Jamestown, Virginia. For those of us who don't know, Jamestown is the origin story of the modern Black freedom struggle, because that's when about 20 enslaved Africans from Angola who were taken by Portuguese slave traders are kidnapped by British privateers and brought to Jamestown Colony, Virginia. Right? And that's the 400-year struggle this year, what Malcolm X talked about in the 1960s, what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about. This is the anniversary of that 400-year struggle. And when we think about this beloved community, what Dr. King talked about vis-a-vis that beloved community was a community that was free of militarism, materialism, and racism. And how do we get there? On one level, our view and image of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is very positive and celebratory, but it's an unearned celebration. Every January, the third Monday in January, we celebrate Martin Luther King Jr. We celebrate the I Have a Dream speech, but we don't talk about what Dr. King actually said at that speech. At that speech, he says, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. But at that speech, he said, we come here today to cash a check that has been stamped insufficient funds. King was talking about reparations, not just for African Americans, but reparations for all groups that had been racially oppressed, had been ethnically oppressed, had been economically oppressed in the United States. When King talks about democracy in Letter from Birmingham Jail in April of 1963, he says that the young people who are being arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, are one day going to be remembered as heroes. And the reason why they're going to be remembered as heroes is King makes the argument in Letter from Birmingham Jail is that these young people are going to be remembered as heroes for bringing us all back to those great wells of democracy that were dug deep by the founding fathers. So what King's legacy for all of us is this idea that racial justice stands at the core of who we are as Americans. It's not a burden. It's a responsibility. It's not something that we should cast aside as un-American, as unpatriotic, as subversive. This is who we are because King and the entire civil rights movement reimagined the contours of American democracy. And when we think about these contemporary movements, March for Our Lives, immigration rights, LGBTQ, the Black Lives Matter movement, the women's marches, these are movements that are amplifying King's idea of a beloved community. And for the next few minutes, I want to talk about how does that beloved community look? Yesterday, we were with Dolores Huerta, Ambassador Young, and Ambassador Young said that there was a point in the 1960s where it seemed tantalizingly real, this idea of the beloved community, that we were almost there with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. When we think about by 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was leading a poor people's campaign with a multiracial, multicultural, multi-gendered cast of characters who wanted to do nothing less than transform what it meant to be an American citizen. And for King, citizenship guaranteed rights. And when we think about this idea of citizenship, right now in 2019, our idea of citizenship has to be global. It goes beyond just being an American citizen. We are all citizens who are born anywhere, on any place, on any part of this planet. When we think about this idea of citizenship in 1968 to 2019, this idea of citizenship is not just having the elimination of mass incarceration, not just eliminating inequality, not just eliminating voter suppression and all these institutions of oppression that restrict our citizenship. Dr. King said, yes, we're going to have to eliminate that. But then he said, what does it mean to be a citizen? Before we could talk about food justice, and environmental activists now say food justice, Black folks have always been talking about food justice and trying to get access to 3 square meals a day. Before we talked about food deserts, Black people were talking about Jim Crow and racial segregation and saying there were no supermarkets and fresh vegetables where they were at. Before people had notions of wellness, Black people were saying, and King met poor Black folks in Marks, Mississippi, the poorest zip code in the United States in 1968. He met hundreds of children who had no shoes, parents who had no blankets, and people who were sleeping in shotgun shacks that rain could come through right here in the United States in 1968 in Marks, Mississippi. King was in tears. Dr. King was in tears seeing this kind of level of deprivation right here in the United States. And so he vowed to start the Poor People's Campaign right there from Marks, Mississippi in the spring of 1968. And the deprivation and the inequality and the segregation that Dr. King struggled against in his own time that prevented us from having this beloved community continues to haunt American democracy in our own time. Now, I said this was going to be an optimistic talk, and it is. And for the next 7 minutes, I want to talk about what can we do to get to that beloved community? Well, first of all, we have to have candid conversations about race. I applaud Mark Updegrove and the LBJ Foundation and the LBJ Library and the LBJ School for sponsoring this event. We have to be able to talk to each other and disagree on what the solutions are, but what we can't disagree on is this idea of common humanity. I'm all for what Dr. Moore said about diversity of thought, but I can't have a conversation with people who don't believe that Black people or LGBTQ people or Latinx people are human beings with inalienable rights, with fundamental rights, right? We have to have a common denominator. We have to say, we value each other. We value each other's children. We value each other's pain. King talked about transforming hearts and minds and being empathetic, but he also talked about utilizing nonviolent civil disobedience as both a sword and a shield to transform our day-to-day. So what can we do in 2019 to transform these things? We've got students here, we've got activists here, we have organizers here. We need to agitate, educate, and organize. Three things that Dr. King did. We think of King as a peaceful warrior. King was confrontational. He was nonviolent. He talked about a moral and political revolution, but he was combative. He was combative in search of social and political justice and this idea of a beloved community. At the March on Washington in 1963, August 28th, Dr. King says we're going to have to struggle together, go to jail together to transform the status quo in the United States. He said after that transformation, the sons and daughters of enslaved Africans could sit aside a table of sisterhood and brotherhood alongside the sons and daughters of people who had owned them in the past. But it was going to take work. His last speech, April 3rd, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King says we've got some difficult days ahead of us, but we can get to that beloved community. And right now, when we think about how does that beloved community look, we too often think about transforming the racial and the political and the gender oppression, but we don't think about the guaranteed rights and the justice aspect of that beloved community. King argued that justice was what love looked like in public. And when we think about the beloved community in 2019, it's got to be a community that is free of residential segregation. It has to be a community that is free of public school segregation. It has to be a community that is free of rampant economic inequality. It has to be a community that defines diversity broadly, but we always remember that the situation we are in right here in the United States is absolutely fundamentally connected to racial slavery and the original sin of the United States of America. And when we think about that original sin, it's not the legacy of slavery that we are dealing with. We are dealing with its continuation and its evolution. Michelle Alexander calls it the new Jim Crow, but it's not just vis-a-vis mass incarceration. It's vis-a-vis every single aspect of American society. The only way we will ever heal this wound is to confront it forthrightly. And we know as Americans, we can confront any problem or challenge on the face of the earth. The optimism of this talk is the fact that during the Second World War, between 1939 and 1945, the United States mobilized the biggest industrial revolution in the shortest amount of time in history. The optimism of this talk, is this idea that in 1961, John F. Kennedy said that we were going to bring a man on the moon, and by the end of the decade, it happened. The optimism of this talk is the fact that we are Americans and global citizens, and we tackle and we take on big ideas. There isn't a bigger idea that we can take on and a more worthwhile idea than this notion of racial justice. But we've got to be willing to speak truth to power. We have to have more than just courageous conversations. We have to have impactful conversations. We have to understand and dialogue about white privilege and white supremacy. And we've seen the basketball player Kyle Korver just got the internet on fire and just blew up the internet yesterday by publishing a piece on white privilege as an athlete. And this is somebody who is a good man who's talking about mistakes that he's made, but has admitted that even when one of his good friends on his team was assaulted by a police officer, he thought to himself, what did that person do to deserve that? And now he's questioning himself, and he's having that courageous in public conversation that we all need to have. At the end of the day, what Dr. King said, the beloved community was going to be a transformed community. We're going to have to learn how to share power. We're going to have to learn how to share success, how to share failure, but we're going to value each other in different ways. The reason why we say Black Lives Matter is because we realize in this country that until Black Lives Matter, all lives will never matter in the United States of America and globally, right? And so, I know I've got 90 seconds here. And so, when you think about social justice, I'm a professor here, very, very proud and honored to be at the LBJ School and in the Department of History. Social justice is racial justice. We think about American democracy. Racial justice, gender justice, LGBTQ justice, justice for the poor, justice for the mentally ill, justice for those who are AIDS and HIV positive, justice for those who are Muslims, those who are Jews. This is the core of who we are. What is so special about this experiment, what is so important about being here, right here, where the Lyndon Baines Johnson Library, where we have a president who signed a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act and a Fair Housing Act, is that when we think about who we are as Americans, small d democracy is the greatest political experiment the world has ever known, and it can transform what is wrong, like racial slavery and Jim Crow, into aspirational visions of where we can be vis-a-vis this beloved community. We can transform inequality, racial segregation, white supremacy into a multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that is free of the militarism, racism, materialism that Dr. King spoke eloquently against in 1967 and 1968. We have the capabilities to do this. All we lack is the courage and the will to coalesce our power as intellectuals, as activists, as business leaders, as thought leaders, to make this our #1 priority. Whenever we make something in the United States a #1 priority, we absolutely have transformative powers to change and reimagine the entire world. Thank you.